Hey, this is Ben Tanzer, author of UPSTATE. I want to thank you for reading the book, and I want to thank you for inviting me to answer some questions about the book. So here it goes. I'm going to answer the questions in the order I got them, and then if there's follow-up questions, Professor Masciotra will help you find me. But first, what motivated you to write UPSTATE in short stories? I feel like I am reading isolated stories, but they all complete the book. Good opening question. So a couple of thoughts here which may help set some context for the whole set of answers I'll give you. First off, the first 7-8 years I was writing, I was not getting anything published, and I was trying to think about how to get things published, and I had this idea that maybe I should write a group of stories at the same time that hung together. I was influenced by books like When the Messenger is Hot by Elizabeth Crane, Drowned by Junot Diaz, and then just literally everything by Raymond Carver, though maybe most especially what we talk about when we talk about love. And what caught my attention with those collections, or what I felt was catching my attention, was that these were books, these were collections that felt like they were all reflecting a certain time and place. And I thought, what would it look like to capture a time and place? And so the stories per se didn't have to tell any kind of linear or connected story, but I wanted them to be connected by a time and place or location, what have you. And so I built them around the city of Two Rivers, which is a fabricated name, but I did grow up in a small upstate New York town that was bisected by two rivers. So that's the question there, which helps, I think. I didn't write the stories thinking they should be connected. They are isolated, but they become less isolated if you continue from the opening book, Repetition Patterns, into the second book, So Different Now, into the third book or third collection, After the Storm. Then you see the characters coming back, growing up, getting older, intersecting with one another. Each of those collections was written 4 or 5 years apart, or 3 or 4 years apart, so it's sort of an 11-year span. And just for a little more context, the first collection, Repetition Patterns, I really had this idea in my head, like, let's write about the sins of the father. And then the idea with So Different Now was the chickens come home to roost, right? So you start seeing the reverberations of how people were raised and the parents they had and the town they grew up in. And so what does that look like as that catches up with you as you, the character, or as the character is growing? And then After the Storm was very intentionally sort of what would happen if some great storm passed through this town and sort of cleansed it, right? Or purged the city of all of its sins and negatives. And so each of them has its own organizing arc, and each of them builds on the previous one, and ideally you're watching these characters grow over time. So again, standalone stories that complement the larger world I'm trying to build. Why do you end short stories with lots of emotions? By the end of both stories, I don't know which stories those are, but by the end of both stories, I felt mixed feelings of thrill and regret. Good. Like I could feel the pain of the guy and George, I believe, Pac-Man Fever, and I do not know how I feel about that in a good way. So yeah, I don't purposely try to end anything with emotion, and I don't write like that. What I try to do is write till what I think the end of that story is, right? So I almost always know how something's going to start and finish, and I have some ideas about how I'm going to get there, and then I just start writing. I do think, though, you're picking up on something which I hope is accurate, which is I write with emotion and I write about emotion, right? I'm very interested in how people communicate and how they fail to communicate. The things they suffer, whether it's violence or neglect or isolation, and how they cope with that, how they cope with their inability to become more self-aware or to get past their fear. And so something's going to end, and it's going to end with some kind of emotion. And yes, I would love the idea that everyone would feel a thrill and a regret every time they finish one of my stories. You know, my real hope, which is my own hope as a reader, is that you feel happy or sad or someone punched you in the stomach. I just want you to feel something. Then I know I've achieved it. And so I'm glad you don't quite know how you feel, and that you're okay with it, right? That's more important. Are the stories characters based on people you know in real life? Are there any real life scenarios in this book? So that's a both and. Every story has some sort of real life scenario in it. Every story has some piece of something. It's just that there is no story where I'm just telling you a story, right? Meaning I'm not telling you a story that happened start to finish. I'm building on something I was stuck on. So take Pac-Man Fever, which I think there's even a question about that later. When I was a kid, when I was 14, 15, there was a guy in the neighborhood who was the king of Pac-Man. We didn't call him that, but I watched him play in the pizza. I was about to say pizza parlor, but that sounds really 1950s. But there was a pizza joint in our neighborhood, and you could watch him play, and he was phenomenal. And he did sit there with a cigarette, and I mean, everybody smoked back then, but different world. But it was all very casual, except for him playing. He was very, very intense. That guy also later killed himself, which really had a huge impact on me. I don't know if I know exactly what it was, but it was certainly very traumatizing. A friend of mine, his father found this guy hanging in the backyard. I will not go too far down that rabbit hole, but it always stuck with me, as did the death or suicide of another young man around that time, around that age. So, I never understood it. And I always thought in my head it was interesting that this guy could be so good at something. I mean, I know it's Pac-Man, it's not finance or what have you, but and then you can go kill yourself. Like, how does that happen? Everything else about that story, though, is just stuff I started filling in, right? He's got a father named Starnsy who owns a candy store. There was a candy store in the neighborhood. There was a guy named Starnsy that owned it, but he wasn't this guy's father. Starnsy was a bit of a shut-in. So I just sort of molded that. There was no mom or wife, but I did have a friend whose mother was rumored to have left his father to go live in some sort of sex cult or something, downstate somewhere. I was upstate. So you start writing a story and you start thinking what gives it tension, what gives it conflict, what brings emotion, and there you've got a story. And every story has that. And every story has a slice of something where I thought, what would that look like if we played that out? Right, so we answered that. It seems you're able to describe a lot of the characters' personalities and passions in just a few pages. Was it difficult to pinpoint certain details to make the most impact in such short stories? That's a great question. That is not an entirely conscious thing. What's conscious is this old adage, show, don't tell, right? You can tell a story. I'd like to think I'm a great storyteller, as is your professor, Professor Masciotra. But, what you want to do is show people what's going on in those stories. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's the right detail or the correct detail. I just spend a lot of time thinking, what are the details? And then we go with it. And then I make changes and I make edits. There's another story. Title's escaping me, but you might remember it, or it doesn't matter. You haven't read it. But there's a couple, and they lose... they fall apart. They break apart. And this guy's wife actually goes back to a former boyfriend who this guy stole her from in a story in the second part of the book. And then after the storm, that marriage falls apart. At one point, I thought maybe the marriage should fall apart because they lost a child. But then when I reread it and showed it to an editor, he's like, everyone has a kid dying. What's another way to do this? Then I just thought the relationship just ran its course. They were drinkers. They were too drunk to be together. That made more sense. That's the story. That's the detail. But there was one detail about a child and some trauma, and then I moved that out and put in a second detail that was more subtle but maybe more effective, which was just these people couldn't stand to be together. They couldn't stand to be alive. They just couldn't. They had stopped functioning as humans, and that's the story. Okay, speaking of which, sort of. From Fern to the father to the ending of Things Start, death is conveyed in different ways. How did you decide to approach a topic of death from multiple perspectives? That is also a great question. I don't think about that. And I want to say, by the way, a lot of my answers start with I don't think about that. That's true. It's just true. What I think about is where should a story go? What should it look like? Now, that said, if you take a story like Fern in The Gift, nothing about that story is even remote. I mean, I know it's fiction, but like none of that's really true at all. I woke up one morning, I read the newspaper. There was a young woman, probably around your age, who was going to work and was on her bike and got hit by a truck and died. That was really the whole thing, but it was sad. And I couldn't let go of it. And so she became Fern. So that's a death that I read about in the paper. Someone I have no connection to and someone I don't know. But I did start thinking, okay, so there is a slice of a story. Someone gets hit by a truck on the way to work. Then I started asking myself, what's the rest of her story? You know, the opening section of that story, I do this sort of like brain dump about all of her personality traits and quirks. So in that case, at the same time, this is, 15 years ago, I had a younger cousin who died in a car accident, and it was horrible. And she was amazing, and she doesn't have to be amazing for that to be horrible, but she was amazing. So I used her, I channeled her as I wrote the story, and I thought, what would Fern be like if she was like my cousin Jenny? That gives you the opening of the story. Fern herself comes, from this other young woman I read about, and the rest of it I just made up. Something about sound really intrigued me, and I threw it in. You mentioned the father dying. He drinks himself to death, right? I don't know which father we're referring to. I apologize. But the father in the trilogy of the Shooting Stick stories, he drinks himself to death. I have no reference point for that. But what I wanted was to create a father who was getting in his own way about being alive, being a father, being connected to his son. And it seemed like drinking was a good way to do that. I don't have any experience with that personally. But that was on my mind as I wrote about that person. And then with Things Start, I think there's another question about this later. I wanted to write about a couple in the middle of a fight who don't know how to communicate, who refuse to communicate, who stop paying attention, right? And they have this terrible accident. So that is not based on any reality I know. However, a good friend of mine told me about being in the car with his wife when she got a text from some guy had some thing going on with at work and how much he was stewing about it. And I remember thinking, what might that look like? Around the same time, again, I was reading the newspaper, and I read about a woman who was driving home, possibly drunk. I should probably remember that. Not that it matters. She hit a person, didn't realize it or didn't think she realized it. I don't know. But kept driving home, goes to bed, wakes up the next morning, and there's literally a person stuck on her fender who's still alive. I mean, I would say you can't write that, which sounds so cliche, but, that's how things start. That's how I got that death, completely unrelated from the story this friend told me. But that's a death. It's a horrible death, and it's incredible. My favorite part about your stories is that they seem to be familiar to me, even though I've never experienced similar events. What do you think contributes most to the relatable nature of the book? What makes it so relatable in your opinion? Well, that's a high compliment, and I really appreciate it. And I think the main thing is that I'm trying to write about emotions and coping, and those are universal, right? So I don't think of writing stories that are universal. I think about, what do people experience? They get into fights with their spouses or their brothers or their mothers. They experience violence. They are abused as children. They are related to someone who's an alcoholic. They fall in love, and that love is unrequited. They get in their own way. And I think if I'm writing that well and effective, then you know what that feels like. So sure, you haven't hit someone with your car, but you may have had a fight with a significant other, or you may have been in love with someone who fell out of love with you, or fell in love with someone else, or who knows what. Those themes are universal, and those I draw on while I try to tell my own stories, and I do believe that's what you're connecting with. When you wrote Pac-Man Fever, was your main target audience of young adults or adult readers? This is a long question, but I know Pac-Man is a classic game. True. But as technology and videos have evolved, it stopped being a center for video games. Sad. Many people have heard of Pac-Man but have not actually played it. So back to my question, is your target audience? Does Upstate have the same target audience for the whole book, or do some short stories differ? So, this is a great question. And this is an obnoxious answer. I never think about audience, so I apologize. I honestly think about, what would I find interesting? What do I find interesting? What's entertaining for me? And, there may be a certain narcissism to being a writer. Your professor can help me out here. Or being a creative, or being anyone who puts stuff out in the world, which is, I honestly believe I'm writing something that someone will like. On the other hand, I don't even think about that. I honestly really do think about, what do I want to write about? And it's true. I want to write, though, with the idea someone will find it, but I never look at target audience. And, interestingly, ironically, whatever the right word is, my father was an artist and was not as successful as he might have wanted to be. And he died a long time ago, but one of our running dialogues, and he was still alive, and when he was seeing that he was not going to break out or whatever was going to happen to him, he used to say to me, I never found a target audience. You have to find one. And so I have ignored his advice. I'm a terrible son. And that's a terrible answer to your question, but it is true. I write what I want to write. At the end of Shooting Stick, it says what was learned was not to give a shit. And the person in the book greatly treasured being taught that, which I must agree with, because sometimes it does come in handy in certain situations. What do you think? Do you believe that's something that should be treasured? Treasured is strong. In this case, though, that's a word I used, and that's a word, or maybe it's a word you used, but I think we both use it. And it is true to that story. What I think is important is that if you feel a lot, and I feel a lot, I feel it. I feel everything, my own experiences, my children's experiences, my friends' experiences, my family. Like, I feel a lot of emotion, and I put a lot of emotion into these stories, even if the emotion is stunted or difficult. And so it is incredibly valuable, I think, to not give a shit at times, which is really just to say you can't allow yourself to feel everything. I do think you need to, let me rephrase that. You can't allow yourself to care about everything. You have to experience it. This is me being a dad, I guess, or a professor too. Like, I don't want to discourage people from saying don't experience things, or feel them. But you also can't get stuck on them, right? My characters are getting stuck, and that is not a way to live. So is it valuable to not give a shit at times? Yes, 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 it is. In our lecture, Professor Masciotra told us you started writing right after 9/11 and began to write on your bus ride home following the attack. My first question is, do you think that if the 9/11 attack had not happened, would you still have started writing? So really interesting. That's a yes and no, or a both and. I was already writing before 9/11. I was not getting a lot published, and I wasn't finding openings, and I didn't have great connections. And I was then on the East Coast when 9/11 happened. I had been in New York the day or two before for a family event. I was off in Maine for work. I had no way to get home. And it's funny, I could have driven, and now I would drive. Like, I would do that so quickly. I don't know what I was thinking then, but I took the bus. I decided the bus was the way to go. I was on the bus for about 36 hours. And as I was getting ready to go on the bus, I thought I should write all of this down in real time. And as I did, being a writer, I thought, okay, this is going to be a great essay, which is really obnoxious and kind of crass, but also opened a door. A major literary journal was really interested in that piece, and I got to read that piece and get that piece published, and it opened doors, which I hoped it would, which I was looking for. And so, yes, I would be writing no matter what. That wasn't an intentional thing. I was writing before, then I was writing after that. That really did open a door, though. And I think it also opened an emotional door, both in terms of nonfiction, which I hadn't spent a lot of time on and I came back to, but also in just getting a kind of rhythm and starting to dig, right? So this goes back to some of the earlier questions. Are you ready to dig into emotions? Are you ready to, bleed on the page? I think I was doing that earlier. I was definitely doing that afterward. Things Start is a criticism of the way we make excuses for bad things in our lives. Sorry, is Things Start. And I know I touched on Things Start already. In the story, it jokingly suggests that the reason the car crash occurred is because of things that happened far off in the past, instead of the actions taken moments before the crash actually had an impact. Is that similar to the way we deny blaming ourselves for our own actions? I love that question. So, this is interesting. I've been rewatching Sopranos lately. And, one of the themes on that show, if you haven't seen it, which is about a mob boss and his family and, all that, is that the past is never dead, right? In that universe, the past is never dead. Everybody feels an endless series of slights. They're endlessly angry about everything. And it's always paying forward. It's always pushing forward. It's always reverberating forward. I don't know that the whole world's like that. I don't know that every human being is like that. But what I do know is that we are all products of our childhood, of those who parented us, of where we grew up, of the choices we made and didn't make. And so, yes, what you're seeing with Things Start is very purposefully a way that a person sees how their choices and their feelings and being in love, how that affects them today, right? That we're a constant culmination of everything before. Hopefully, we can find healthy ways to think about those things. Hopefully, we can address things that upset us, where we get stuck, that we're scared of. But, here are two characters, and, we're particularly seeing this through the male, he's the protagonist. He's looking back across the course of their relationship thinking, this is where things went right, went wrong, and here we are now. So the idea really isn't to deflect blame as much as to say, how well do I know myself? And in my job, in this case as the writer, is to show that there's a whole life before this, right? These stories don't come out of a blank slate. They come out of a series of decisions and lives lived. You're just meeting them at a point in time. What is your opinion on character names? Is it simply a name you like, or do you put a lot of thought into deciding the name? Definitely don't put a lot of thought into it. I don't force it either. I don't try to get cute. That could be fun. I love authors who come up with interesting names that reflect where they are, who they are. I don't think what's the word? I'm not clever enough for that. I would like to be more clever. I just go with the names that seem right. That is not super interesting, but it is very accurate. As I write, a name comes out. And that's the other thing, which is a lot less or maybe even more romantic about some of this for those of you aspiring writers. You don't know everything when you sit down, and I don't even pretend to. Some of this stuff comes out of your own brain, your own experiences, people who reminded you of someone, or characters who remind you of people, or who knows what. But yeah, I don't put a lot of thought into it, and it is sort of magical or some kind of alchemy, but mainly you're telling a story and those things start filling themselves in. Out of all the short stories in Upstate, which are you most proud of and why? Shooting Stick is a story that feels very complete to me, though it's funny. There are 2 stories that follow it throughout the collection. There is a small trilogy, but Shooting Stick is one of the first, to me, great short stories I wrote. A lot of narcissism there, too. But, it pulled together so many things I care about, which is childhood and pop culture and time and place and fathers and sons and parenting in general. So Shooting Stick is very high on that list. I also like Things Start, which we've talked about, because I love the rhythm of it. It felt like really fast and it felt very real time. And, things that feel real time and electric are like super exciting to me. So those are 2 that jump out. Shooting Stick has a special place in my heart. Things Start, I don't know. That one just really spoke to me. And interestingly, side note, there was a really sort of more famous writer I was dying to meet at some event I was at. And I read Things Start. I was reading at this event, and this sort of famous writer came up to me afterward and said, "Oh, hey, where can I find that story?" So that's a humble brag, I guess, and quasi name dropping. But, that story is now stuck in my head because that writer is stuck in my head. I feel like you end your short stories with a lot to think about. Do you believe the ending is the most important part in creating a story? I really don't. There, that is again. I don't, because the first sentence is really important too, but all of it's important. And I don't think about structure or whether things are linear and have a beginning, middle, and end. But I do try to nail every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every page. And I'm always trying to toggle between, will this make you happy or sad? Either is fine. What I do want, though, I've sort of touched on this, but not really totally, is that I do want you to feel something all the time, right? I want you to leave with something. So, the endings are the endings, but they do tend to be emotional. It's not purposeful. But of course, we are dealing in emotion. I am dealing in emotion, and I don't know there's any other way to do it. Meaning I wouldn't want to do it any other way, but I wouldn't correct it either. Do you prefer to write short stories? Why not write a long story incorporating many of these self-reflections that you have in these short stories? Good question. I do love to write short stories, but I also love to write essays, and I love to write novels too. In a way, what you're saying is, what's a long story? To me, a long story is a novel. What happens is sometimes things just feel like something, right? An idea pops in my head, and I think, oh, that feels like a story, or that feels like an essay. Sometimes I'm even like, that feels like a whole book. And I've been lucky enough to write novels, but I don't have a preference. I have lately been trying to write longer short stories as sort of an exercise to see, to see what the storytelling looks like. But, I will say this. I always believe that, at least with the first draft, wherever it stops, it stops. If it's short, it's short. If it's long, it's long. But again, I think the important thing here is that things feel like things. They feel like stories or essays. Also, the separate connected part of that is I do get into modes where everything feels like a story or an essay, and then I just go with that. But why don't I write something longer? I am A, writing some longer stuff now, but B, in a way I read that is, why not write a novel? And the answer is I have done that, and I agree with you, and sometimes those stories do just feel like a novel. Do you always try to implement a lesson or something to think about in writing a story, or do you write something simply because you thought it'd be interesting? Definitely the latter. I'm sure that's a theme of all my answers so far. I am interested in what I find interesting, and I'm interested in what I think is interesting, and I always write about that, and I let things fall where they may. Definitely never consciously add lessons. At times I may add like an issue that seems important to me. You know, I want to make a comment about sexual harassment, or I want to make a comment about the healthcare system, but only to serve the story. As far as lessons, no. I would love if lessons emerge, but definitely not conscious, purposely not conscious. Probably happens anyway. All these stories tend to give off a notion of a deeper meaning, and contrary to the intended storyline, was this intellectual aspect of your work purposeful? Why or why not? That's an awesome question. So look, we have an obligation to write a story, to craft something that looks and feels like a story. We also have obligations as writers to show, as I've talked about, what's going on in the world, to plumb emotions, to flesh out characters, to describe where they are, to give a sense of their history. If you do that, you bring deeper meaning, right? So I don't consciously have to bring deeper meaning, though I very much appreciate you regarding that as intellectual, because I would love to be an intellectual, you know, like your professor. But I am trying to get into all the stuff I just mentioned: emotion, feeling, backstory, history, the town itself, the universe. That brings deeper meaning when you do it well. So yes, I'm doing that, but it is purposeful. I'm not trying to create a balance of that. On the other hand, I do want to strike something here, which is, or make a comment that's striking me. It's not contrary either, right? A good story, a good anything, it's not contrary. You're telling a story and you're bringing depth, and together it forms really all the kinds of things you all have been asking about. Do the events in these stories have any direct correlation to moments that you were confronted with in real life? And if so, what made you comfortable enough to intertwine them in your work? I've totally touched on this a little bit. I won't go too far into it, but yeah, absolutely. Every story, there's a slice of something. You know, there's a story in here where a guy meets a woman at a bar. This is the woman that followed him home when he was a kid. I don't know if you guys read that one. The name's escaping me, though I think it's so different now. He then gets very caught up in this woman, wanting to be involved with her. She's got a guy she works with at the bar. This guy is sort of a loser from their high school. It turns out she's dating this loser. She's too embarrassed to tell the guy. The guy is forced to confront the loser. Well, the loser confronts him. The loser pulls a knife. It works out. There's a lot of stuff going on in that one story, though it's ultimately a story about a guy falling in love or something with someone from his past, and that person from his past is involved with someone else from his past, right? That's a great story to me. Someone did once pull a knife on me when I was involved with someone who I had no idea was involved with this other person. That's real. The person who pulled the knife is not someone I grew up with. The person I was involved with was not someone I grew up with. So I projected them onto a story like they might have been people I grew up with. On the other hand, there was a woman, then a girl, who followed me home and sat on my lawn. That part's real. The knife part's real. And somehow those form a story. Also, the loser guy was sent off to juvie when he was a kid. Well, kids I grew up with did get sent off to juvie, or whatever they called it in upstate New York in the 70s and 80s. That guy existed, but he's not the guy in the bar. These are different people coming together to tell a story, all of which are true things in my life. Am I comfortable with all that? Absolutely. The only stuff I won't write about is stuff that might embarrass my mom, my wife, or my kids. I'll deal with any of my friends if I need to. And with my kids and wife and mom, there may still be things to deal with. Why am I comfortable with it? I don't have a good definition. I just feel that I can't write honestly if I don't put things in that pop in my head. That's the main thing. I don't try to be honest, but if something's in my head and it works on the page, I just trust that I have to go with it and will deal accordingly down the road. You know, there's another story, Stevie, you probably didn't read. It's about a guy who all these younger guys idolize. There was a guy I idolized in high school. Very decent guy, never did anything truly embarrassing or heinous that I can recall. But in the character Stevie, in the story Stevie, that character does do something heinous. Something heinous that did happen in my high school. A friend of mine, her sister being beat up by a boyfriend. All of that is real. Her boyfriend wasn't someone I knew, and that boyfriend is Stevie in the story. Well, when my younger brother read that story, he knew the guy I had modeled it on, and he said, wouldn't he be upset? And I thought, I'm not sure that guy reads. and I don't know him anymore. But, I guess I would deal with that if I have to. That's a terrible answer, but it's true. It's true. I'm going to put things on the page. There are certain people, certain ideas that are off limits, but not a lot. And nothing that would embarrass me. I'm totally comfortable being embarrassed, and I'm happy to talk more about that. Let's finish this up here. What story resonates with you as the most under the Upstate series and why? Oh, so that's sort of a repeat. I think Shooting Stick really captures a lot, but there's also the story that opens after the storm. I'm blanking on the title, I'm sorry, but there's a story there which I referenced earlier where a marriage sort of implodes and the wife goes back to a former boyfriend and they have lots of drinking problems and the storm hits, and there's something to me quite beautiful about that story, because ultimately in that story the husband who's been deserted goes and saves his alcoholic wife and her new boyfriend from drowning. And I just thought, yeah, that's the story. That has a lot of meaning to me. He eschews, right, all the other stuff and just says, they need to be saved, I will save them. So I kind of love that one, and it feels very Upstate to me. And then finally, what are some of the major drawbacks from being an author of your caliber? Well, first off, thank you for calling me an author of caliber. That will always be appealing. Here's what I would say about that. And I think my caliber could be debated, though I feel very, very blessed with all the cool things that have happened for me, including stuff like this. I don't know if it's about caliber per se, but, once you start, things start happening, you get published, you find people that like your work, you get invited to speak at conferences, you win awards. Sorry, all that sounds like bragging, but those are all things I wanted. And those are all things that have happened, and it's very exciting. So the two problems that start to come out of that is you want more, I want more, and you can't always have more, and then you've got to figure out, I need to figure out how to adjust my expectations. But also, it's not just about wanting or having more. You fail, right? So there's no writer I know who still doesn't get rejections and get notes, embarrassing notes about something they wrote that someone doesn't like, or someone's not interested in your work, or someone seems interested, and then you get on the phone with them and they're like, nah, I don't, it's like, I don't know what I was interested about. Now I'm not. So this isn't really about caliber, but it is about getting excited about expectations and the fact that there's still lots of failure and rejection, endless, and I guess it's on a higher level, and that can be even more painful because, to go back to the first point, you're hoping things will come and then they don't come, or they sort of come, or they fall apart, and that's the drawback. The other drawback is that I can't, and this is a real privileged problem, but I do want to stress it. I write every day, or try to write every day. I still have to work every day. I still have to parent every day. I still have to pay bills every day. I still have to, wake up and be energized every day. And all of that can be hard. All of it is better than not having any of that, right? Or being sick, or, so I'm very conscious of the privilege I have. But, I don't have the freedom to do it the way I would do it, because I don't make enough money, or I don't get paid enough as a professor, or I've never optioned a book. And, most of the great writers I know don't get to do whatever they want, however they want. Some do. But there is that element too, which I'm sorry, that's embarrassing. You don't get to do it exactly like you want to do it. And there is sort of a frustration inherent in that I can't just sit down and wake up and write from 8 to 1 or 2. Some people can. I cannot. So I'm in a weird spot where people want my work, they buy my work, but I'm still living like I've been living for 20 years. On the other hand, and I really mean this, and this is how I started the question, I feel super blessed that I've been able to do everything I've been able to do and do it like I've done it and hope to keep doing it. And here I am talking to all of you. So that's really a thrill. And I'm going to end there because that's plenty of me talking, but I am really, really appreciative that you all had questions for me. I'm really appreciative that you read my work. I'm very happy to hear from anyone with any follow-up questions or really anything. So with that, I'm going to give you and your professor a break, but I'm going to thank you. I really am. I really, and I've used that word a lot. Sorry, that's poor editing, poor self-editing. Anyway, thank you. Honored. Good night. Appreciate you taking a look at the book. All right. Bye.